At exactly 8:17 a.m., something happened that would change humanity forever. There was no explosion. No warning sirens echoed through the streets. No governments declared an emergency. The sky looked exactly the same as it had the day before, painted with the soft colors of another ordinary morning. Birds continued singing outside bedroom windows. Traffic slowly filled the highways, and millions of people reached for their coffee without the slightest idea that they were about to experience the strangest day in human history. Nothing looked different, but something had disappeared. Pain, not reduced, not weakened, gone. For a few minutes, nobody noticed. Why would they? Pain only exists when something goes wrong. And on that quiet Tuesday morning, life seemed perfectly normal. Office workers hurried toward train stations. Children laughed while running across school playgrounds. Construction workers climbed steel beams hundreds of feet above the ground. Doctors prepared for another busy day at the hospital. Every person on Earth believed they had woken up in exactly the same world they had fallen asleep in. They couldn't have been more wrong. The first signs appeared in the smallest, most ordinary moments. A man in London bit the inside of his mouth while eating breakfast. Normally, the sharp sting would have made him stop chewing instantly. Instead, he continued eating while unknowingly tearing through the inside of his cheek. He only realized something was wrong when he looked down and saw blood dripping onto the white collar of his shirt. Across the world, a little girl reached into the oven to grab a tray of cookies before her mother could stop her. Her tiny hand wrapped around the scorching metal pan, but instead of screaming, she simply smiled in confusion. "It isn't hot," she said. Her mother stared for a second before rushing toward her. By the time she pulled her daughter's hand away, the skin had already been badly burned. The child never cried. Within the next hour, thousands of strange stories began appearing online. Someone uploaded a video of themselves punching a brick wall over and over again without flinching. Another person pressed ice cubes against their skin for several minutes, just to prove they couldn't feel anything. At first, everyone assumed it was some kind of internet prank. Then hospitals started calling each other. Doctors from different cities noticed something impossible. Patients weren't arriving because they were in pain. They were arriving because family members had discovered horrifying injuries that the patients themselves hadn't even noticed. One emergency room treated a cyclist who calmly walked through the front door, carrying his own bicycle. He apologized for wasting everyone's time because he thought he'd only scraped his knee after falling on the road. When doctors cut away his pants, the room fell silent. His kneecap had shattered. Fragments of bone had shifted out of place. Yet he had ridden almost 5 kilometers before deciding to visit the hospital because something looked strange. He never felt a thing. Meanwhile, social media exploded. #NoPain became the biggest trend the internet had ever seen. People celebrated. Athletes posted videos lifting impossible weights. Boxers punched concrete walls. Friends challenged each other to hold their hands over candles. Millions laughed as if humanity had finally unlocked a real-life superpower. Television hosts joked that dentists would soon go out of business. Comedians called it the greatest day in history. People who had suffered from chronic pain cried tears of happiness, believing they had finally been freed from years of suffering. It felt like a miracle. For a few glorious hours, the entire world celebrated. Nobody realized they were celebrating the beginning of a disaster. By late afternoon, the first deaths were reported. Not from accidents, from things nobody expected. A 68-year-old man collapsed in his kitchen while preparing dinner. Doctors later discovered he had suffered a massive heart attack hours earlier. Under normal circumstances, the crushing pain in his chest would have forced him to call an ambulance immediately. This time, there had been no warning. Elsewhere, a university student complained that she felt strangely tired. She decided to take a nap instead of visiting a doctor. She never woke up. Her appendix had burst earlier that day. Normally, unbearable pain would have sent her rushing to the emergency room before it ruptured. Instead, her body stayed completely silent. Hospitals around the world began noticing the same terrifying pattern. People weren't arriving too early. They were arriving far too late. Broken bones became crushed bones. Small burns became life-threatening infections. Minor injuries became permanent disabilities because nobody knew they needed treatment. Emergency surgeries doubled within hours. Doctors worked nonstop. Yet every patient brought the same impossible problem. Where does it hurt? I don't know. When did the pain start? There isn't any. For the first time in modern medicine, one of the most important diagnostic tools had vanished overnight. Pain had always told doctors where to look. Without it, finding the problem became like searching for a single broken wire inside an entire city. Then researchers remembered something that almost nobody else had ever heard about. Hidden inside medical textbooks was the story of an incredibly rare condition known as congenital insensitivity to pain. Only a tiny number of people in the world are born with it. Most people hear about the condition and immediately think the same thing. That sounds amazing. No headaches, no broken bones hurting, no burns, no suffering. A real-life superpower. But every doctor who had ever treated these patients knew the horrifying truth. Children born without pain often chewed through their own lips while eating because nothing told them to stop. Some walked on fractured feet until the bones slowly collapsed beneath their own weight. Others accidentally scratched their eyes so badly that they permanently damaged their vision. Several patients wore helmets almost every day because they couldn't tell when they had seriously injured themselves. Pain had never been their enemy. Its absence was. As scientists compared those rare medical cases with what was now happening across the entire planet, one realization spread through every research lab at the same time. Humanity hadn't evolved to survive without pain. Humanity had evolved because of it. And if they couldn't find a way to bring it back, the coming days would become far worse than anyone could possibly imagine. The following morning, the excitement was gone. The internet was no longer filled with people laughing while punching walls or holding their hands over open flames. Those videos had been replaced by something far more disturbing. News channels across every continent opened with the same headline. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Ambulances couldn't keep up. Doctors were no longer treating people who were screaming in agony. They were treating people who had absolutely no idea how close they were to dying. Emergency rooms became scenes of complete chaos. A young mechanic walked into a hospital because his co-workers noticed blood soaking through his boot. He smiled awkwardly, apologizing for making everyone worry over what he assumed was a small cut. When doctors removed the boot, the room fell silent. A large metal shard had pierced straight through his foot hours earlier while working in the garage. Because he never felt the injury, he had continued walking on it for the rest of the day, pushing the metal deeper with every step. The damage was far worse than it would have been if he had stopped immediately. Stories like that became frighteningly common. A chef finished an entire dinner service before realizing both of his hands had been covered in severe burns from grabbing hot pans throughout the evening. A marathon runner crossed the finish line smiling, only to collapse moments later after unknowingly running several kilometers on a fractured ankle. Construction workers continued lifting heavy equipment with torn muscles because nothing warned them that their bodies had already reached their limits. Everywhere doctors looked, they saw the same terrifying pattern. People were no longer stopping when they should. The human body had always relied on pain to force people to slow down. Without it, everyone unknowingly pushed themselves beyond the point where the body could safely recover. Then another crisis appeared. Parents. Across the world, mothers and fathers became terrified to let their children out of sight. Playgrounds that had once echoed with laughter suddenly became almost empty. Children climbed higher than ever before because they felt invincible. They jumped from rooftops, raced bicycles down steep hills, and treated every dangerous activity like a harmless game. One 7-year-old boy fell from the top of a climbing frame during recess. He landed awkwardly, stood up immediately, brushed the dirt off his shirt, and continued playing football with his friends. Teachers assumed he was perfectly fine. Hours later, his parents noticed that he was walking strangely. Doctors discovered that his hip had fractured during the fall. Every step he had taken afterward had pushed the bones farther apart. A simple injury that could have healed in a few weeks had become a life-changing operation. The doctors weren't shocked. They had expected this. Children learn from pain long before they understand language. A toddler touches a hot stove once. The burn teaches a lesson words never could. A child falls from a bicycle and remembers to be more careful next time. Pain quietly shapes human behavior every single day. Without it, children stopped learning where danger truly began. Schools closed within 48 hours. Not because the buildings were unsafe, because nobody could guarantee the students would survive a normal day. Meanwhile, scientists worked around the clock searching for answers. Research centers from Tokyo to New York shared every piece of data they collected. Neurologists, geneticists, surgeons, and physicists all reached the same terrifying conclusion. Nothing inside the human body was actually broken. The nerves were still there. The brain was still receiving signals. Somehow, the final sensation itself had disappeared. It was as if someone had muted one specific sound in the orchestra of the human nervous system. Nobody understood how. Nobody understood why. One theory suggested that the brain had stopped interpreting pain signals while leaving every other sensation untouched. People could still feel pressure. They could still recognize warmth and cold. They could feel someone holding their hand. But the warning, The sharp alarm that screamed, "Stop right now," had vanished. Governments responded with emergency broadcasts unlike anything in history. Every television channel interrupted its programs. Every phone received the same alert. Do not assume you are uninjured simply because nothing hurts. Inspect your body regularly, seek medical attention after any accident, no matter how small it seems. Entire countries changed overnight. Factories introduced mandatory health inspections every hour. Professional sports leagues suspended all competitions indefinitely. Airlines reduced flights after discovering that pilots could unknowingly continue working despite serious medical conditions developing mid-flight. Military training exercises stopped. Even amusement parks closed their gates. The world had become too dangerous. Insurance companies collapsed under an endless wave of medical claims. Hospitals ran out of available beds. Doctors converted conference rooms into emergency treatment areas, while medical students volunteered to examine patients around the clock. But despite everyone's efforts, they were losing. Not because injuries had become more severe, because they were becoming invisible. Then one story spread around the globe. It began with a firefighter named Daniel. When an apartment building caught fire just after midnight, Daniel rushed inside with the rest of his team to rescue a family trapped on the third floor. Thick smoke filled every hallway, making it almost impossible to see. Normally, the intense heat would have warned firefighters when their protective gear was beginning to fail. This time, Daniel felt nothing. He climbed higher into the burning building, unaware that flames had already damaged parts of his suit. By the time he reached the trapped family, the skin on both of his arms had suffered catastrophic burns. He successfully carried 2 children to safety before collapsing outside. Doctors later said something that haunted millions of people. If he had felt pain, he would have known when to turn back. Daniel survived, but he would never fully recover. His story became the symbol of an entire world learning the same brutal lesson. Pain had never existed to make life miserable. Pain existed to draw a line that said, "Don't go any farther." Without that line, human beings walked straight into danger without ever realizing it. And as scientists desperately searched for a way to restore what had been lost, the death toll continued to rise. Because the greatest threat wasn't the injuries people could see. It was the countless injuries still hiding inside bodies that had completely forgotten how to ask for help. So, what if humans never felt pain? It might seem like the greatest superpower imaginable, but as the world discovered, pain was never the enemy. It was the guardian standing between us and irreversible mistakes. Remove the warning and the danger doesn't disappear. It simply arrives in silence.